Hello everyone. We're looking at chapter 22 here, Revolutions in the Atlantic World, 1775 to 1815. So in this chapter we'll be looking at primarily Western Europe, causes of revolution, revolt, the idea of the rights of man. We'll be looking a lot at France, revolutions in France. We'll be looking at Napoleonic wars, sort of what Europe looks like before and after Napoleon. We spent a lot of time on France because France came to basically politics and warfare and the whole geopolitical landscape came to be dominated by France during this time period. And this also would be talking about the United States, the American Revolution, but I'm not really going to cover that. That's something that I'll leave to a U.S. history class. All right, backgrounds to revolution. This period was ripe for revolution for two reasons. We see ideas of freedom and equality, largely due to the Enlightenment learning, the Enlightenment ideas moving across the Atlantic, back and forth, all across Europe. We see the increase of trade, constant warfare, between the different colonies, between the different European powers in their colonies around the world. This actually weakened a lot of them. I've mentioned it before. Constant warfare weakens countries. It seems beneficial at first, and it allows them to expand and grow, but it also can weaken them, spend a great deal of money as well. We see revolutions, American Revolution, French Revolution, Napoleon's wars. Social change. So although social classes maintained traditional privileges, the nobles had privileges, clergy had privileges, expectations, the patterns are beginning to change. We see city populations increasing, we see more food, it's more affordable, we see growing populations, both urban and rural, that's city and country both. We see more women taking jobs, more children working as well, which means higher incomes. Most people still live what we would think of as poverty, but they're able to, the level of poverty in the late 1700s would be much higher than what we think of as like the peasants in the 15 and 1600s. People can afford a new thing now and then. They can afford, there's cheaper manufactured goods. They can afford food, clothing. They can put glass in the windows of their house, for instance, things like that. So we see incomes increasing. Now the rich are always rich. Where the incomes increases that matters to us is among the poor and the lower middle classes. A lot more liberation, a lot more education, and simply access to a lot more that society has to offer in a more urban environment. We see distinctions between like the lords, what we would sometimes refer to, I don't know if I had it on here, I don't have it on here, you might hear the term landed gentry. What that simply means is nobles, aristocrats that own land. Gentry is sort of that aristocratic lord, noble class. And they own lands usually. And then you have people who would never have really been thought of as rich, like merchants, city merchants, for instance, are now moving into that middle and rich and elite class. Simply monetary wealth. Not because they own land, not because they have titles, because they're simply becoming rich from trade. And sometimes they do become nobles. That does sometimes happen. They would invest money into trade. They could become equivalent of like merchant lords. Just as rich, and even in cases richer than the actual nobility, the actual gentry class. But not because of family or title or lineage, simply pure economics, purely money. So we had successful merchants in this growing middle class. We do occasionally see them buying titles, buying estates, making themselves into landed gentry, the new riche, the nouveau riche, the new rich. Now this caused economic blurring. It became not always clear. Before Europe was a very class society, it still is, but now it's not always clear which class you're in, which class you came from. We have common people that are sometimes elevating themselves up to rich, but yet many of the aristocrats would still look down on them. They might actually have more money than them, and they would still look down on them as inferior to them. So we have this middle class elite that really starts to blur things. Now, the majority of folks are still relatively poor, but there was no such thing as a middle class, really. In traditional European society, you were either a commoner, which is generally poor, or you were an aristocratic lord, one of the gentry. Now we are starting to have this growing middle class. It's still a small percent, maybe 10%, 15% maybe, of a middle class, but that had never really existed before. So changes to classifications of slavery were also established. European law, but in the 1700s, came to establish slaves. Even indentured servants really could only be people of African descent, black African descent. Like in the colonies, free people of African or mixed African heritage were subject to laws that often limited their liberty. So even in places where you weren't a slave, you still had very restricted access to opportunities to own land, to have jobs, freedom we might think of, to have rights or ability to vote, things like that. Although voting wasn't really a thing quite yet. That's sort of happening in this time period, sort of coming. Slavery comes by the late 1700s to be specifically Africans. And indentured servitude, again, almost goes away because it's too similar to slavery. And there becomes this idea in much European society that white indentured servants, which generally would do the same job slaves would do, the same type of menial labor jobs, whether it is labor or whether it's agriculture or farming, it became too similar. And so indentured servitude for whites almost goes away. Because whites, remember, indentured servitude, you choose that. You actually sign a contract. You choose to be an indentured servant. And so most white people won't do that anymore. They simply won't because it is too similar to slavery. So becomes pretty much the indentured servitude slave class becomes black only. Bear in mind as well, very few actual African slaves in Europe. The 99% of the African slaves that the Europeans held were in the colonies. Let's see what's next. All right. Growing demands for liberty and equality. Many reformers, reform is simply people who want to change the laws, and in their view, if they're a reformer, they consider themselves a reformer, they believe they're wanting to change laws and policies for the better. And generally this is the case, and better usually equates in this context to more rights, more liberties, more opportunities for the middle class and below, politically, socioeconomically, across the board. So these reformers in this time period, they believed that people should be making the choices, not the monarch, that the people should actually have the power to make laws, and only the people should have a right to limit their own powers, whether it's action or rights or freedom of expression or things like this, or speech, religion. This idea often referred to as popular sovereignty. The idea that the sovereignty, the actual power, the actual authority to decide to decide laws and the direction of a nation should actually be in the hands of the people, popular, versus monarchs. Now, this isn't accepted all across Europe by any means, but this becomes a more common theme, especially in Western Europe. We see this. People should be able to choose representatives as well. The people should actually be able to choose the people who run the government. They actually should be able to choose those lawmakers. And, of course, the lawmakers, we mentioned the social contract before, the idea that the people choose the lawmakers, the representatives, and then the representatives represent the people's needs and wants and desires and the demands of the people, this representative government. More and more discussions about that all men have identical rights and liberties, that this becomes more popular. People begin to question why the nobility, the aristocratic class, the lords and ladies, should have all these special privileges, simply because of their birth and their wealth. And a lot of people began to question that. What right do you have to have more than me, to have more opportunities than me, to have a better education, to live in houses and have all these fancy things simply because you were born or because you have a title, something like that. And people start to question a lot of that. We see people such as like Thomas Jefferson, for instance. Thomas Jefferson, America, he held very supportive thoughts of sovereignty. He, interestingly enough, he actually advocated for anti-slave laws. He actually advocated against slavery, even though he himself held slaves. He was one of these guys that would come across and describe it this way: I obey the laws, and the law says I can own slaves, so I own slaves. But I wish the law were changed so slavery was outlawed, and then I wouldn't have slaves. Why? What's that hypocrisy? It's about money. Thomas Jefferson's slaves generated incredible revenue for him, as it did for slave owners. Therefore, for him to give up his slaves would have left him at a lower point, would have left him economic disadvantage to all the other people who still owned slaves. So Thomas Jefferson was all for eliminating slavery, but everybody had to get rid of him. He wasn't willing to do it because it would hurt himself and his family economically, as most slave owners would have thought. But if everybody had to get rid of him, then that would have been good, because then it would have put everybody back on an even playing field. So even though he advocated for that, he himself was not willing to give them up. It's an interesting idea, but it all boils down to one thing: money and power. What do rich people like more than anything? They want more money. That's what wealthy people want. They have money, they want more money. Most weren't willing to grant this equality. Because they did believe in this. They did believe in the white superiority. Even those that advocated, it should be noted, even those that advocated against slavery, they still didn't believe in any type of black equality. They didn't believe in that at all. They still believed blacks, Africans were inferior. They believed pretty much anyone who was non-white was inferior. Non-Christian was inferior. So even those that advocated for anti-slave, even those that talked about equality, as Jefferson did, they still didn't think, even for a moment, that Africans were equal to whites. They still believed whites were superior, and they still believed that educated was superior above all else, and rich was superior. Those things went hand in hand. Sex equality also wasn't really equal. There was no real sex equality, but that kind of went either direction. Most women would not have considered themselves equal of men. Most women were, from the time of birth, sort of trained, indoctrinated that women were inferior, that men were superior. So there wasn't really a push for any type of sexual equality from the vast majority. I'm not saying there weren't a few outspoken people. There were a few women that did speak out about it. One woman in France spoke out about it, even wrote a book about it. What'd they do? They beheaded her. So, yeah, the idea of sexual equality wasn't really a thing that was really pushed at this point in time, even though there might have been a few people who thought this should exist. It wasn't any type of a movement. Sovereignty was thought evolved from this idea of this sovereignty from the intellectuals. Locke, we've mentioned before. These philosophers, these social thinkers. John Locke, of course, he wrote all about the natural rights of man, about the protections, claiming that government had to protect the rights of man, had to protect these rights, which weren't always clearly defined, but they existed, that men should have rights. Again, very generic, as it says there in the quote: all men, all mankind. Of course, understand all mankind didn't include Africans. Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, health, or possessions. The thing you've heard, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that's not a real thing that's actually quoted like that. They would refer to life, liberty, and property, because property would have equated to happiness and success and status. So it would be life, liberty, and property. Most of these men in this time period would not have thought even for a moment you could be happy being poor. Ironic when you consider most people were poor, and yeah, anyway. If you were tyrannical, you should be removed. If there was tyranny, that shouldn't exist. There should be popular sovereignty under Locke. And Montesquieu. Montesquieu, he placed sovereignty in Parliament. See, Montesquieu's was some of these people like Locke and some that followed him put the idea of sovereignty among the people. Montesquieu put the idea of sovereignty in the actual government, but not a monarchy, in a representative government. And what most of these places end up getting that have these revolutions is they get this mixture of popular sovereignty, but it really becomes a representative. The people are sovereign and they choose the representatives, and the representatives govern, which is like the type of government we have here. And that this representative government should always defend the liberty and interests of the people. Again, it all goes back to the same thing. The people choose representatives in government, and those people in government should represent our needs and interests of the population. However, if you really look at their writings and really boil down is the wrong way to put it. If you actually look at it in detail, who did they actually think the people were? That's a question you have to ask. Was it the masses of people that were poor farmers and poor laborers? It really wasn't. If you actually look at who the people were those who were educated and able to make decisions. The people were those that they didn't have to be rich, but they had to have some type of status. They had to, own land. Just a common poor farmer laborer, which was the majority of the population. That isn't necessarily that they think was actually represented, because those people didn't really have the ability to decide proper leadership, to make proper authority. So most of these folks that believe in natural rights of man and this popular sovereignty, the power they actually put the hands in was not in the masses of the commoners, but actually in this more middle class, this new middle class that was emerging, that were typically stable economically, not rich, but stable economically, middle class, usually educated. That was actually where they were putting the power, because those are the only people who are really capable and competent enough to choose the actual representative leadership. So, just as it says there, John Locke, all mankind. No, he didn't mean blacks. He didn't mean Africans. He didn't mean, so you gotta understand the way they spoke in this language didn't always, it's a little, the actual meaning behind it, the context you have to understand behind some of these guys. They were thinking and talking as middle and upper class white men of the 18th century. They really weren't thinking about equality of women. They really weren't thinking about equality of Africans. They really weren't thinking about equality even of the absolute common poor people who don't know what's good for them. That's what they would have said. The image of liberty, I think, is really interesting. I think this is French. Yeah, this is French. La liberté. What aspects does painting make it radical? What makes this radical? Think about that. Well, first of all, who's the figure of authority here? The figure of authority in this image it's a woman, a young woman. She's not a saint. She's not Jesus. It's not an aristocrat or a king, a monarch. It's a woman, all right? She sort of has this look of basically sort of Greek mythology, sort of this look of a like a Greek goddess type. Although she is supposed to be a person, this isn't supposed to be representative of a goddess. She wears relatively plain clothes, a plain robe, a plain tunic. She has a copy of the Declaration of Rights of Man. That's what this is. You can see that if you look at it. Which basically rejects the entire idea of nobility and the church rule. It is the rule of the common people. The only legitimate government is a government created by the people. That's what Rights of Man would have really sort of claimed. Equal rights for all men. I think it's interesting. They would have framed it that way, equal rights for all men, even though this is a woman. She might be the symbol, but most would have still not thought about equal rights for women. Like I said, a woman in France actually spoke out and talked about this and wrote about the freedom of women, and they killed her. They executed her for it. So, yeah, you got to be careful. We have a pike. She's holding a pike there in her hand. That's a weapon. It's got a red cap known as a Phrygian cap. What is a Phrygian cap? It's actually a symbol of liberty dating all the way back to the Roman Empire. Europeans still love to emulate and talk about the Roman Empire, and many, again, French kings and Russian kings still like to see themselves as sort of descendants of the Romans. It just shows the sort of, All right, and if you do think about mythology in this, sort of what's it mean? What are some mythological figures, women that might, like Athena, the protector of Athens, Greece. Minerva, this idea of Minerva, which was the Roman. If you know about the Roman and Greek gods, they're the same exact gods. The Roman and Greek gods, they're the same. They simply changed their names. When the Romans, what's what the Romans did? The Romans did so well is they basically assimilated cultures and brought those cultures into their own culture and made it Roman. So everyone they conquered, they took what they had and made it into Roman, and then it was all Roman. They conquered the Greeks. They took the entire Greek culture, all of it, including the gods, and made it their gods. One of the things the Romans did so well and made them so successful. So Lady Liberty here, she represents not just freedom, but also the idea of fighting for it, because she's holding a weapon in one hand. One hand is thought and ideology, and the other hand is a weapon, indicating that willing to fight and do whatever is necessary to fight for this freedom. We have Justitia, which was a Roman goddess of justice. You might think it represents her as well. Interesting. There's lots of ideas and lots of thoughts to see in this and kind of significance of it. Lots of imagery. Another reason imagery was so important for people back then, many people were still illiterate. Illiteracy was still common across Europe. So imagery held more power than words for a lot of common folks. They could read the imagery and understand a lot of aspects of it, even if they couldn't read the words. They understood the image and the significance of it. I mean, we still respond to stuff like that today, even though we're all literate today. It's interesting. All right, 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War. This could be classified as the actual First World War. It isn't. It's not the First World War, but we could really call it that. It greatly weakened Europe. It opened the door for revolutions. It brought countries down. This was a pretty devastating war. It was pretty significant. It was huge, this 7 Years' War. European worldwide altercations. We see fighting across the globe. Simply, the European powers went around the entire world, literally the whole world, making colonies, laying their claim on lands across Asia and Africa and South America, North America, Australia, across the entire world. And every time these European powers met, it caused altercations and issues and problems and conflicts. And these conflicts basically become global, become sort of a global warfare. England, Prussia versus France and Austria was probably the main part of this. These origins go back 50 years, or much longer than that, really. England and France have been fighting war and conflict for centuries and centuries. Austria and Prussia bordered on each other, so they had constant. Anytime you have countries that have common borders, there's always all kinds of tension and frictions, especially in this period where they're all kind to grow and expand. So Austria and Prussia had a problem. They didn't get along with each other, England and France. Anyway, we see conflicts in Europe, Americas, Asia, Africa. All this collectively was known as the 7 Years' War. However, the main two culprits, the main two players in this war was England and France. They were the ones that were the biggest players, because even though Austria and Prussia were pretty powerful on mainland Europe, globally, neither one of them had a strong global presence. England and France did, though. England and France had land, claimed huge chunks of land, half of continents, in North America, South America, Southeast Asia, Africa. They laid claim to all these lands. And so even though Austria and Prussia was more landlocked-based warfare in Europe, England and France was global. The New World colonies became the battlefield in the 7 Years' War. British confronted the French in North America, what becomes the North American colonies, and also some Canada as well. And this was known as the French and Indian War. This was the war in North America, which is really it happens just right before the American Revolution, just 10, 15 years before the American Revolution. This was identified as that. The conflict between European powers came to an end. Again, we could spend an hour talking about the 7 Years' War, but the conflict between European powers finally came to an end when the French signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763 with the English victory. It wasn't really that big of a thing as far as the victory goes. It was some land passed back and forth, and England is the winner in this. But in truth, both of these countries won, really. France still had global land. They still were expanding. France's power was probably... They lost some parts of the Americas, but globally they weren't really necessarily weakened by this. Because they didn't really fight it out in Europe. They didn't really duke it out in Europe. They really duked it out in their colonies. This was more colonial wars. Now, Britain did have, they had a good stronghold in the Americas now, and they did have a vast trade empire. By this time period, they certainly had the largest navy in the world. Comes at a high cost. England and France were both strapped with debt, incredible debt, and they had to find a way to pay that debt. And to pay that debt, it often led to taxation of the population in England and in France, which in both places leads to revolution. One, you get the United States, and you get an independent sort of a revolutionary period in France, which pretty much destabilizes the entire nation for decades. Massive war debt. So we have territorial claims, we have the British colonies, you see some there in North America, you see Spanish, New Spain. At one point, Spain controlled pretty much all of the Americas. And by the early 1700s. And then by the mid-1700s, France took over a big chunk of North America, and a lot of that goes back to the British after the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War from, I don't know if I had the dates on there, 56 to 63. It was 1756 to 63 was the dates of that. And as you can see, what comes out of this is we get these established colonial lands, which were established at the end of the war, although some of them had already existed. And then you have that proclamation line of 1763, which is very interesting. What England agrees to do is what England tells the colonies, is the colonies can't go past that line, that proclamation line you see there. And the colonies almost immediately go past that line, which causes incredible conflicts. And of course, England taxes the colonies, which causes the colonies to be upset by that. And then to ensure England gives them the money they want, they send in all kinds of troops. They send in tens of thousands of redcoats. That's the British soldiers, which really pushes the colonies to revolution, and eventually you get the United States out of that. This shows you conflicts: Austria, France, Russia, Saxony, Spain, Sweden versus England, Portugal, and Prussia. It's pretty ugly, and this is not referred to as a world war, but it is really. It's a world war, really. Now, most of the rest of this chapter is going to talk about France, because it does become the geopolitical center of Europe, and it becomes the, how to put it exactly, all the affairs of Europe for pretty much the next 30, let's say 25 years, next 25 or so years, almost everything that happens in Western and Central Europe, dozen different countries, revolves around stuff in France. France becomes the center of Euro geopolitics for the next quarter century. And a lot of that's not good, because a lot of that's bad in warfare. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Revolution in France, 1789-1791. All right. We see this great revolution, which rocks the world, known as the French Revolution. And it's interesting because there's two. There's a French Revolution, which someone would say extends all the way for a dozen years, and some historians will divide it into two. There's a French Revolution and the Second French Revolution at the end of the century. It's hard to really say. Some will take it as one continuous process that lasts like a dozen years. And another, it's sort of two different revolutions, because there is a sort of a calming period in the middle. All right, incredible French debt. Incredible debt. stemming from the different wars, especially 7 Years' Wars. Luckily they helped us. We're lucky. Had the French not assisted us in the colonies, we wouldn't be here today. We did not defeat the British. The French helping us allowed us to beat the British, but had the French not assisted us, England would have most likely won the revolution. Again, they were unequivocally the most powerful country in the world. Had they actually brought the full weight of their power onto the colonies, they would have quickly put down the rebellion. And people like Washington and Jefferson would have found themselves executed or hanging from a noose. Have no doubt. But because the French helped us and the French protected us for years, we were able to eventually force the British to surrender. But had they not assisted us, we never would have even had a chance of winning the revolution. A couple of upstart colonies against the most powerful nation on the globe. But luckily, we were very lucky. All right, so to pay this, they had to tax the incredible amount of taxes, which were the peasants, the poor. Louis XV was the king at the time. He was concerned about enacting the taxes because he knew enacting the taxes, it would be unequal, it would be unfair. He knew that the taxes would be primarily upon the poor, and he also knew that it could cause revolution. He knew all this. He talked about it. He wrote about it. He or his people who worked for him wrote about it. He did it anyway. He did it extreme. By 17, just within a year or two, taxes had like quintupled. 5 times. Imagine if suddenly today your taxes were increased 5 times over the next year. I mean, yeah, protests, marching in the street, riots. I mean, you can't even begin. It would, if some reason like that happened in America, it would collapse our society. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking a multiple increase in taxation. He knew it would cause unrest, and he did it anyway because he had no choice. He couldn't pay his bills. He couldn't pay anything. Now, the respect for him had sort of eroded because a lot of people hated him, frankly. Or they became to hate him because they hated her. He had a mistress, which was public. People knew about it. It wasn't really hidden. And of course, he's basically supposed to be the divine ruler, the hand of God, chosen by God, and of course the Catholic Church, which this is not allowed. You can't be cheating. It's against God. It's against all the rules. So he did this anyway. He basically polluted the aura, this divine aura of the king, by having an open relationship with a mistress. Some people called him a degenerate. It's called a desacralization because he would have been sacred. As the king, as the divine right, as we talked about previously, he would have been thought as touched or blessed by God, sacred. Well, this removes his sacredness, desacralization, and also people just came to dislike him and sort of hate him. Then his death came along pretty suddenly, was unexpected. We get a brand new ruler, the 16th, Louis XVI, which takes over. Good intentions, eager to please, but he was no match for the discontent among the French population. He was too young and too inexperienced to rule what was maybe one of the most contentious and most turbulent and controversial and war-torn nations on the globe, and not to mention it was huge. It had probably the largest land army in Europe, a huge population. Yeah, it was. Even an experienced ruler like Louis XV was losing control of. He'd been ruling for years. He was losing control, much less a brand new young ruler. He didn't stand a chance. Now, France's system of government, incredibly convoluted. And probably that because, and I'm just sort of saying in generalization, it had been built and rebuilt and restructured and rewritten a dozen times in the last 300 years. So they kept taking the government, rewriting it, changing it, altering it, adding in laws, taking out laws. They just basically kept tweaking the government, changing it, because this was a very enlightened area and lots of education, and with always talk about changes and stuff. So it was very convoluted, complicated government. It had a legislative body, which was called the Estates General, which again covered all 3 estates, the clergy, nobility, and the commoners. Commoners, the 95% of the population being the commoners. The last time the Estates General had met, not kidding, 180 years. It had been 180 years since the Congress of the National Assembly had met. Typical lifespan in this time period was less than 40 years. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, between 4 and 5 generations. Your grandparents' grandparents' parents. I mean, that's how long we're talking about since the actual assembly had actually met. Pretty crazy if you think about it. So, now, with that in mind. So, we have all kinds of attempts to impose taxes, reform the government, change it, rewrite it, put laws in law, take laws out. We see extreme pressure for the population. The king finally does it. 180 years, he finally calls the Estates General to actually make changes and rewrite laws and to try to deal with the growing hostility and anger of the population. Marches and protests, parts of cities burning on a regular basis. The country was coming apart, it seems. All right. When the three estates gathered, the three estates, clergy, nobility, and the commoners, the three estates, took over a year for it to actually happen. Took over a year for them to actually get it all together, to actually form it. No one even really knew where to begin. The delegates of the third estate, that's the commoners, the regular people, which is the vast majority of the population, they are the ones who paid most of the taxes. They found themselves in conflict with the other two. Of course they did. The clergy and nobility usually sided together. They were the rich, the wealthy, the lords, the nobility. The church was wealthy, the priests. Now, how did they vote in the Estates General? It's crazy. How did they vote? There was literally 3 votes. 3 votes to make decisions on laws. Each estate got 1 vote. So all of the commoners, millions of commoners, and then however many hundreds or thousands they had in the actual estates, the actual National Assembly, or not the National Assembly, sorry, incorrect. In the actual Estates General, we're not to the National Assembly yet. In the actual Estates General, they got 1 vote, all those thousands of people. And then the clergy and nobility got a vote. The clergy and nobility almost always voted together. They almost always voted together, which simply was 2 to 1, and they got it. So the rich and wealthy people stuck together with the church and always voted together. And then, of course, the commoners their vote didn't really matter. Now, the delegates of the third estate swore an oath to actually not disband. Even though the voting always went towards the clergy and nobility and they made all the decisions, and then they tried to actually disband the assembly after making all decisions which benefited them, the people of the third estate refused. They took an oath among themselves that they would not, under any circumstance, disband until they formed a new government. And they called this the National Assembly. This idea of this new National Assembly government. Also, they wanted something else. They wanted a whole new constitution. They wanted to make sure this didn't happen again, that it was unfair voting, and that they didn't call it again for 200 years. And the idea that they actually would have more power. Now, the king called for this to end. This is known as the Oath of the Tennis Court. Sorry, I didn't say that. That's the Oath of the Tennis Court. The king actually called for it to end, and they refused. And the king then said they were in violation because both the clergy and nobility voted for it to end. Therefore, it was supposed to end after they got what they wanted, which very little. The taxes were still on the commoners. The king organized the soldiers, about 18,000 soldiers. They were supposed to come and bring the delegates and arrest them all if necessary. So basically the military is mobilized to put down this new National Assembly, which the commoners claim represents them, the actual people of the nation. 18,000 soldiers. All right. So, 25% unemployment across the country, high inflation, soldiers marching across the nation trying to put down riots and protests. The people who call themselves the rightful government, the National Assembly, are basically being harassed, attacked, and arrested for trying to represent the people of the country. The idea that the king didn't actually care about the population, the king didn't actually care about the people, and it was just the rich and wealthy in the church having all the power and control. Revolutions start to rock the nation. And France is huge. We see revolutions start to rock all across the country, all the major cities. We see them storming the Bastille. That's an image here of the Bastille. The Bastille was the huge prison that they were arresting people and putting them into. They were arresting hundreds of people and putting them in this prison. They stormed the Bastille because it served as both a prison and also a guard and weapon repository. So the guards in the city would go to the Bastille to get weapons, to protect themselves in case of a riot. So it was an armory. It served as both a prison and also a place to store weapons or whatnot. And they basically storm the Bastille, taking the weapons out of there, the guns out of there, gunpowder, etc. It gets quite ugly. This is in 1789. Now, once the people of, this is happening in Paris, once the people of Paris basically revolt and take to the streets, thousands of them armed with weapons from the Bastille or other weapons they had, running through the streets with weapons, pitchforks, knives, axes, whatever they can get, guns, obviously some guns, and the belief that there's about to be an actual, true, full-on revolution trying to overthrow the government, the king quickly says, stop. Pull back the troops. I'll take away the soldiers. He gives, I don't want to say he gives an apology exactly, but he's like, wait a minute, okay, we'll talk. Believing that the city is on the verge of outright revolt, that they're going to actually, I mean, it's Paris, right? I mean, if you lost Paris, that's sort of the cultural heart of France. It's too late. It was too late. We were past the tipping point. The National Assembly claims it is now taking charge, that it is now the authority. It is the true authority. They rescind all noble privileges, claiming the nobles are no better in any way, shape, and form than commoners. They don't have any rights or privileges. And I hadn't really talked about that, but nobles had all kinds of rights and privileges. They were not subject to the same laws, the same punishments. They didn't get taxed the same way. If they were punished in a much more lenient way than the severity. I mean, peasants stole food, they could have their hand cut off. I mean, that's ancient, that's like Roman, but they still could do that stuff in Paris. You could commit a minor crime and go to prison for 20 years. None of that stuff happened to the nobles or the clergy. So they rescinded all their rights, and they claim you're now just like the rest of us. You commit a crime, you're going to be subject to the same punishments, etc. They then published the Declaration of Rights of Man. You can see it right here. I know you can't really see it, but that's a painting of it. Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which guarantees equality of all before the law. In other words, a king, even a king, a lord, a noble, a priest, or a common peasant, all should be treated equal under the law. This is crazy. This is the idea that everyone in society, regardless of your status, from the absolute top to the absolute bottom, didn't include slaves. Don't confuse that. You weren't really a citizen if you were a slave. And there was some very limited slavery in France, but a very, very small little bit. Everyone was to be treated equally and considered equal. It's quite interesting. All right. That's what they wanted. That's what they declared. That doesn't mean that's what happened. That's what they wanted. That's what they expected. Again, doesn't mean it happened. None of this really stopped the actual violence. Thousands marched on Versailles, which was the home city, the royal city. Paris was really the heart, living, breathing heart of France, but Versailles is where the royal palace was. That's where the king stayed. Lots of guards. They march on Versailles. They invade the National Assembly, and they yell that they want bread, not talk. It's interesting. We actually see an uprising even against the Assembly. Even though the Assembly claims to represent the people, and they're trying to get things changed for the people, the masses of people, it's, well, as it says, it's anarchy. Everyone who's in authority or has any type of power, even the Assembly, which does seem to represent the commoners, it's composed of commoners, but even these commoners are still upper, they're still more like middle class. They're sort of that middle class group we talked about a little while ago. merchants, businessmen, maybe some lawyers, doctors, things like that, educated. So even people in the National Assembly that represented the commoners, they weren't nobility and they weren't clergy, they weren't royalty, they still didn't necessarily look and talk like your common laborer or peasant or farmer. So they were also sort of seen as the enemy. Even though they were advocating on behalf of the people, they didn't necessarily, people actually in this National Assembly didn't necessarily look like commoners. They were still the upper level of the commoners. So for many commoners, they basically looked like the people who were already in charge before. They wanted bread. They didn't want to talk. They were starving. They were fighting. They wanted the taxes to end. Yeah. All right. This goes on for give or take 2 years. This violence goes back and forth across France. Lots of people die. This sort of goes on back and forth for a couple of years, give or take to 91, 18 months, something like that. Finally, a constitution is written, finally put together. There's enough peace brought in the streets. Constitution's put together. The king agreed to honor the Constitution, and in this new Constitution, all power was taken from the king. He was basically just a figurehead at this point. Power was taken from him. All the power was given to the National Assembly. Now remember again, National Assembly claims to represent the people, but the people in the National Assembly are actually the elite of the commoners. They're not just regular poor peasants and farmers and laborers. They're more elite, they're more educated, they're more professionals, and usually with more money. So there's a divide here, where even the people in the National Assembly who represent the commoners, they themselves would have probably not have thought of themselves as commoners. And that's important, because when they make the decisions to really decide how the government's going to go and who's going to make the choices, it gets kind of ugly. All power given to the National Assembly. The king and queen actually flee France. They run from France for fear of getting executed. They do. And here's Our Lady, that I've already mentioned a few times. Now, women demanded representation in the National Assembly. They were given many new rights. We do see the first list of real rights probably ever given to women, an actual list of rights and privileges for women specifically, probably ever given in modern times. We can actually see some interesting things if you want to go back to Egypt or Greece. But as far as in modern history, this is probably the first real declaration of rights and opportunities for women that are given. That's not Olympia de Gouges here. These are actually things that National Assembly gives. They give some of these new rights. However, they don't give them the right to vote. They don't let them have elected office. Now, Olympia de Gouges decides it needs to be a lot more. So she actually writes this Declaration of the Rights of Women. She protests these injustices done to women historically. She claims that the new rights and privileges given to women, which are way more than have ever been done, actually delineated in the law, are still not near enough. Certainly not enough. Women deserve much more. Olympia de Gouges argued, basically, women deserved full equality to men. National Assembly did not think so. Most people didn't think, though. We know from writings, the vast majority of people didn't necessarily think that women deserved this, or were I guess that's the best way to put it, including women. So she writes this, she protests these injustices, it was ignored, and a little while later, I don't have the exact year, she was executed for this. Her idea that women should have full equality to men. It got her killed. Beheaded. So, the National Assembly did more than had ever been done for women before, and the majority of women were happy with this. Because it had never really been lined out laws. But her Declaration of Rights, her particular thing, was way more would have been considered radical or extreme at the time. Far more. Changes to religion also included a loss of power for remember the other two estates, the monarchy, the nobility, that had its power greatly reduced. But the other big estate was the Catholic Church. And there was a reduction in power of the church as well. The church was supposed to be religiously tolerant of Jews, Protestant Christians. Church property was confiscated, taken away, sold to help pay some of these taxes and pay some of the debt. There was a new civil constitution of the clergy written. This constitution of the clergy that established a national church in which priests were elected to office, and there was only one actual religious authority, and it was in France. The Catholic Church lost its mind over this because the only religious authority the Catholic Church was supposed to be recognized was the Catholic Church in Rome. The Vatican, okay, I'm not going to say Vatican. I can't say for sure if it's Vatican, whether that was officially created at this point in time, but it was the Catholic Church in Rome in Italy. That was the only true authority of the Catholic Church. So they actually created their own independent authority, Catholic authority in France. It was still Catholic priests, but now the priests were elected. They weren't chosen by the church. They weren't chosen by the nobility. Yeah. Now, most commoners didn't necessarily like this. Not this specifically, but the whole thing. They wanted changes for them. They wanted less taxes. They wanted more opportunities for them. We see reforms. We see things improving, which is really logical. But most common people wanted total change of society. They wanted everything changed. Revolution was still very common. Many people wanted revolution, revolt, but here's the problem we've got. By this point in time, these people who are sort of pushing anarchy across the nation, which is a lot of folks, they don't really know what they want. They simply want change, but they can't define what that change is. Most of these folks aren't educated, really. They don't know what kind of change they want. They simply want things to be different. And what they still saw was a bunch of elite people in charge with power making laws again, and nowhere did they see that it specifically helped them. So these changes were happening, taking power from the church and nobles and the lords, but what they saw was power reverting from the nobles and the church and the lords, reverting to the National Assembly, which was progress. That was reform. But they still didn't necessarily see that power translating to them at the bottom. And they weren't far off from that, really. Much of it really helped the middle class, the people in the National Assembly and people like them, this new middle class I've talked about developing, that 15%. You got the 5 at the top, which is the nobility and the church. You got 15%, which is this middle class, which are still commoners. They're part of the commoners. But they're better. They're professional, educated, lawyers, doctors, merchants, things like this. And that's who really came to benefit from the National Assembly, which is not surprising considering that is who comprised the National Assembly. That other, 70-80% of common people weren't necessarily benefited by all this. And people came to understand that. The spirit of revolution lingered, didn't go anywhere. Didn't go anyplace at all. World War in Republican France. A lot of things start to get really nasty now. Now, the European response to this revolution was hostile. Why? You should be able to answer this, right? Why would the rest of Europe have a big problem with us taking away all the power from the church, taking away all the power from the nobility, and giving it all to the people? Or what they called the people. Pretty logical, right? All the rest of Europe was ruled by nobility, church authority, and kings. So if France could do this, one of the largest, most significant, most of the most powerful nations in Europe, continental Europe, could do this, and it would be successful and actually would happen, of course, what does the rest of Europe say? Oh, shit. That could happen here. Our countries could revolt, rebel, and all of our power would be taken away. Because who made all the decisions in these countries? Pretty much the rest of Europe, decisions are made by the nobility, the aristocrats, the lords, the kings, the church. One of the scariest things you can do to someone who has power and status and wealth is threaten to take that away. They'll do almost anything to stop you. We see a massive international response against France to stop them from what's happening, to stop this from spreading across Europe. All right. They do finally get a hold of the French king and queen in 1791. They arrest them. They're considered to be direct threats to other monarchies, or they're considered to be direct threats to the nation, to all the nations of Europe. All of this idea of taking the king and queen, which many people thought would be executed at this. They assumed they might be taken and executed, thrown in prison. No other king in Europe is going to be okay with being taken, thrown in prison, or possibly executed. Prussia and Russia issue the Declaration of Pillsnitz, which states their desire to reinstate the monarchy in France. They make it very clear to the rest of Europe they expected the monarchy to be reinstated and given their power back in France. And if not, they would have to take actions to ensure that the king and queen and the monarchy and royalty got their power back. Now, they didn't push so much on the religious aspect, because understand half of Europe was Protestant. So the power taken from the Catholic Church wasn't necessarily frowned upon by many kings in Europe. Many of them thought, I mentioned before, in other chapters, many kings in Europe actually felt that the church had too much power, and they owed too much authority, and had too much authority. So some were probably okay with the weakening of the church, but none of them were okay with the weakening of the nobility and the monarchy. Well, the government is reformed again in France, and it now becomes what we call the Legislative Assembly. The Legislative Assembly is what this new government, this is formed from the National Assembly. And as its name says, it is now, the National Assembly was created to create a new government, a new way of life, a new framework for government and society in France, which it did. Now, a Legislative Assembly evolves out of that to actually govern the newly created framework of society in France. It is to legislate, it is to govern and make laws. Now, this Legislative Assembly had a lot of people in it who were known as Jacobins. They were part of this Jacobin club, which we might classify as a political party. It's not really exactly, but probably for our purposes, the closest thing we could consider it today would be like a political party. Like Democrats, Republicans we have in America. So this Jacobin club advocates freedom and equality among men. No mention of women. Freedom and equality among men. And they were furious about foreign intervention. For two reasons. One, what right do other countries have to intervene or to threaten military action against our country? And number two, the foreign powers wanted the monarchy back in charge. These Jacobins who had taken power, they had power. They were the elite of the commoners. They didn't want to give it up. Certainly didn't want to give up that power. France, in response, declares war on Austria. And very quickly, Prussia joins the war. And so we have France against Austria, and then Prussia joins on the side of Austria. Basically, they're going to work together. Ironically enough, a decade before, Austria and Prussia were fighting and killing each other. That's the thing about geopolitics. Your enemy today is your ally tomorrow. It's the way it works. It's just the way it works. Always has. And so Austria and Prussia basically joined together. They want to get the power back in France to the lords, to the kings. And in this initial stages of the war, this initial beginning of the war, France loses because they're not ready. They are still, this is still like 91, 92. They're trying to come out of this revolution. They have not even really brought stability back to France. The Legislative Assembly is just taking power, just taking charge. They really don't have power control over France yet. There's still things happening and still revolution happening in different parts of France. And boom, suddenly Austria and Prussia is invading. France didn't do so well at first. Austria and Prussia took land and took cities, and it was pretty clear the opening salvo of the war was theirs. Because France really wasn't ready for it. All right. We move into what we refer to as the Second French Revolution. This Second French Revolution. All right. This period starting in 92 is the Second Revolution. The Jacobins. Now, the Jacobins are the political party who are in charge. There are other groups, there are other clubs in the Legislative Assembly, just like we have in our political system. But the ones that have the majority and have the power are the Jacobins. They're the ones that actually are pretty much running and controlling the government. They have the majority. They split into two different groups themselves. known as the Girondists and the Mountain. They split around 1792, so we have a division. We have two new groups that are formed out of the Jacobins. Now, they succeed in executing the king and the queen. They get them executed. They get them killed. These groups were able to withstand Prussian and Austrian forces to reinstate Louis XVI, and by the end of 1792, they have rallied the army, the French army. They've trained new soldiers, and they actually start to fight back, and they start to defeat the Prussians and the Austrians. Now the Austrians and Prussians might have better trained militaries, maybe more professional militaries. But the French have a much larger population. France was about 4 times the population of Russia, or of Prussia and Austria. So a lot more potential soldiers, a lot more people they can put in uniform. Even though the Prussians and Austrians might have been a little better trained soldiers, more professional soldiers, the French had much bigger country, a lot more resources, more money, and a lot more people. And they do start to push back against them. Retaking land and actually taking Austrian land. As I said, king and queen executed. It gets pretty ugly. Now, by 1793, the Prussians were the Jacobins, again, the leading political party. They're the ones pretty much running the show. They declare war, extend this war declaration. They'd already declared it against Prussia and Austria. Now they add Russia to it. They add England to it. They add Holland to it. They add Spain to it, and others. Yes. In essence, in 1793, France declares war on Europe, on almost all other major countries. Got it. England, Prussia, Russia, Holland, Spain, Austria. Yeah. Pretty much every major country in Europe, France declares war on. You would have to say, looking at this logically, crazy. What are they thinking? Stupid. You basically declared war on every other major power in Europe. What are you thinking? They wanted to make a stand. They wanted to make it clear in this that we do not believe in monarchical governments, and we don't want anyone taking our power and authority from us. Now, were the Jacobins actually out there fighting and dying on the front lines? No. They were now the effective nobility. They weren't nobility. They were still technically commoners. They were elite, though. Many of them were quite well off financially. They were now the sort of the effective power and nobility in Europe, even if they were not technically nobility. They wanted to ensure their power because they understood that the rest of Europe had monarchs and would probably try and take their power away from them if they could. Now, here's an interesting irony. The irony of the French Revolution. Okay. France warred all across Europe. They destroyed lands. They took food and supplies from the most helpless people, the peasants and the poor. Basically, the lives who were destroyed in this war, this second revolution, who was actually killed and died, the people, the peasants, the soldiers, were the actual people that the Jacobins and the Legislative Assembly claimed to be protecting. Were the ones they were actually devastating them. Destroying their farms, their land, their livelihoods, killing ultimately hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands ultimately die. These are the people that they supposedly were protecting and trying to save. Quite ironic. And you have to wonder if that irony was actually lost on these people. These elite commoners. Maybe. In 1793, the Mountain takes control. Again, this is a branch of the Jacobins. They actually take control of the Assembly. And again, pardon me, not Assembly. Okay, yes, Assembly. Sorry, I was thinking National Assembly. Yes, they take charge of the Legislative Assembly. And they become the effectual leaders of France. Now, they want to deal with all the different domestic issues, all the foreign confrontations. The Mountain designs or creates the CPS, this Committee of Public Safety. Sounds great, doesn't it? Committee of Public Safety. Yeah. The irony of the Second French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, it's everywhere. All the things they claim to represent, the actual effects of everything they did were almost 180 degrees opposite. It's really pretty crazy. Say one thing and actually they would say it, but the actual effect of almost everything they did was the exact opposite. Committee of Public Safety. What did Committee of Public Safety do? It ended public safety. It basically declared national martial law. There was no democracy, no actual representation. They ended all elections, and they took effectively dictatorial control of the government. This Committee of Public Safety wasn't like a little group. It was the government. It became the government, suspending all types of liberties and opportunities and rights and voting, etc. Yeah. The people who'd taken power in France declared war on the world and then turned around and declared war on their own country. Meanwhile, forcing their own countrymen to actually go fight a war against other countries. It's the definition of insanity. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Yeah. All right. Total war. All right. The Jacobins wage an effective war. France does actually start to win, actually come out on top. It's effective. Again, they have all those advantages I talked about. And the problem is these other countries basically came at France individually one at a time, because most of these other countries were not allied with themselves, with each other. Even though they all ended up having to fight France, they weren't really allies. Most of these countries weren't friends. The Austrians and the Prussians weren't friends with the English. The English weren't friends with the Spanish. They had fought multiple wars. The English hated the Russians. That's the problem. France was united in its power and its money and, of course, its big population, and the fact that their entire country was now geared for war against all outsiders, but all the outsiders didn't actually rally up together. They all fought independently, sending an army in here, an attack here, an attack here. Some hardly even attacked at all, like Russia hardly did anything at all. There was never a united European effort to stop France at this point. That comes later. And as a result, France basically wins. They go a little bit here. They go attack Spain a little bit. They go after Portugal. They attack Austria and Prussia, and they have victories. They're successful. That actually excites people. That rallies people. Oh my, we're winning this war against basically all the rest of Europe that all has these kings and they all hate us. Now, the Jacobins, or the Mountain, I guess, they controlled the government. They controlled the economy. Now, Maximilien Robespierre comes to lead. He comes to become the leader of this group. So even among the group themselves, he actually becomes the figurehead. He becomes sort of the actual dictator. And it's really a dictator. He becomes sort of the dictator of France. We call this period, after the fact, the Reign of Terror. We call this the Reign of Terror. He starts executing anyone and everyone who speaks out against the government. Everyone who challenges the war or speaks out against it or protests. Thousands are killed in mass executions. There are lines of people who stand in line and eventually have to be dragged, actually, up to the executioner block for days and days. People have to stand in line. That's how long the lines... Literally, you're standing in line for days, knowing that you're getting one step closer every day to having your head cut off. And you just have to stand there. March day after day for days. It's insane. They execute thousands of their own people who are all protesting the war, protesting the power of the Legislative Assembly, which is now basically a corrupt, dictatorial, totalitarian government. It's really totally taken over society. It is absolute insanity. Basically, they had to enforce the laws, enforce their rules and laws on society. It's terrorism, only it's actually the government performing terrorism on the citizens. Anyone who opposed the government, spoke out against the government, anyone who talked about revolutionary ideas of freedom would be executed, or spoke out against this idea of it. The Jacobins and the government claimed to represent freedom and opportunity, even though they were simply suppressing all freedom, all democracy, all opportunity, and executing anyone. Yeah. Really quite interesting, this reign of terror. Anyone who opposed the idea of freedom, of course, this was the freedom of this was freedom through violence and death and murder. Now, these concepts held by the French revolutionaries focused on removing the authority of the king, bringing in this feel of nationalism. Now, this was a new idea in the 19th century, and we are turning into the 19th century. 1800 is the beginning of the 19th century. This idea of nationalism. This is really what got people going. This is really what got the soldiers, and France had almost 1 million soldiers. This is really what gets the soldiers fighting. Even though people in the cities are being executed, where the war is being fought, out on the fringes of the country, out in the very rural areas, 1,000 miles away, people on the very fringes of France fighting Prussia and Austria, they don't know necessarily what's happening in downtown Paris, where they're executing everyone who speaks out. Nationalism comes about as this idea of us versus them, and everything as us is good, and everyone who is foreign is evil or bad. And so it doesn't matter what we have to do to keep the peace, as long as we're fighting the bad guys, which aren't us, even though we're executing everyone. The actual people are the enemies, the other countries. This idea of nationalism, modern nationalism, it's all about the nation. Regardless of good or bad, regardless of how much is being done that's bad, the more evil is them. They are worse. The outsiders are the worse. And so let's kill them all. All right. Now, the National Assembly and the Directory. Robespierre continues to send detractors. Anyone who threatens the government to execute them, who speaks out against the government, gets executed over and over and over. Now, the actual people leading this begin to fear that they themselves are going to be executed. Fear that at some point in time, enough people are going to revolt and stop standing around in line waiting to be executed all day long, that some people are actually going to stand up and revolt. Now, Robespierre comes to speak at this, what's called this national convention. Let's see if I have it on here. Comes to speak at what's this national convention. It's not on the slide. He is shouted down by the actual rest of the people in the Legislative Assembly. They shout him down, call him down, and call for him to be arrested, believing he's the bad guy doing this. And he is actually arrested, dragged out, and he's executed in himself in 1794, just like he executed all those thousands of other people. The government and other people in the Legislative Assembly start to come to their senses. Some of them start to actually see the irony of what they're doing and understand that they've created an insane system that they represent an idea of democracy and freedom by executing anyone who speaks against democracy and freedom, who only want democracy and freedom. Some people finally come to their senses and they start to bring some peace to it and understand what they're doing is crazy, and it sort of comes to an end, this reign of terror. Now, when this finally does sort of work its way out in 1794, the national economy is in shambles, there's runaway inflation, there's no food, there's starvation, thousands are dying of starvation, famine, diseases. They bring the National Assembly together. Again, they bring this back. They bring this National Assembly back again. They meet, they reorganize the government, and they reform the government, and they develop a new government. And it is led by the Directory, a group of directors who will run the government and direct it more appropriately, and it's going to be fair now. Now it's going to be fair. Now we've created a new government. It's going to be fair, led by our directors, the Directory. Yeah, in case you're wondering, yeah. The Directory was just as bad as the Mountain and the Jacobins running it a couple years earlier. They are corrupt, they are violent, they're ineffective. Eventually, the Directory takes control of the military and uses it to instill themselves into their own dictatorship, with the 5 of them running all of France. Yeah. They overturn democratic elections, they cancel elections, they again start executing anyone who speaks out against them, they build up a larger military to basically, and bear in mind, through all this, they're still at war with all these countries. They're still fighting wars all across their country, on every border, with almost the other national powers in Europe. Probably what's most surprising about this, during all this insane internal chaos, how did their country not fall? Nationalism. even with all the craziness people saw happening in Paris and saw happening in France and saw happening in the cities, many people still felt this idea of the sort of national pride in their country, while all these outsiders are still attacking. So people still enlisted, people still joined. They were actually forced. They were I've totally gone blank, but they were actually brought into the army. They were forced to fight, and they still fought. Even with all this going on, and they form a dictatorship. And yeah, well, this leads us to Napoleon. So Napoleon, he was a successful military leader. He was a a man of vision and determination. Quite smart. Probably a genius. He learned of a plot against the Directory. There was an actual internal plot from the assembly of some people attempting to take over or assassinate the Directory, believing the Directory was bad, which it was. The Directory was corrupt and bad. They were villains. So there were some people who actually were going to try to overthrow him, sort of like what happened to Robespierre. They overthrew Robespierre, killed him. So he learned that this was going to happen. He understood it was going to happen. He's a member of the Directory. He then steps out of the Directory. He assists the plotters, the ones that are going to take over and try to overthrow the Directory. He helps them to overthrow the other members of the Directory. And has this revolution, sort of this little internal governmental revolution. Now, he does this. Immediately, when it happens, he has the people who are helping him, who are overthrowing it, he gets rid of them, has them killed and executed. Leaving no one in charge except him. Smart, really. Immediately, he institutes this Napoleon's Code. It's based on these liberal thoughts of the revolution. Equality for men, security of wealth and property. Now, it makes most people happy because this Napoleonic Code says everything everybody wants. Everybody's equal. Everyone has guaranteed rights, authorities, voting opportunities. They have guaranteed access to their wealth and property, protection of their property. The list goes on. It is exactly what people wanted. And Napoleon became a hero. He helps overthrow the Directory. The people who helped him do it, he gets rid of them. Either gets them reassigned or killed or disappeared. He's the only one left in charge. He institutes the Code, which makes everybody happy because he tells them exactly what they want to hear. Okay. That's great. That's wonderful. He's our savior. He's the hero. He took away a corrupt government, and he's fixed everything. Great. We love him. It's excellent. All right. Now, the church had suffered all along this. During the Revolution, the church had lost power and authority, so Napoleon actually began to change that between the government and the Catholic Church. Now, in 1801, there had been passed this Concordat of 1801, which basically gave this Catholic reacceptance. It gave a lot more power back to the Catholic Church and to Catholic authority and Catholic clergy. They said Catholics could worship freely. Napoleon gained the right to choose members of the clergy, so it still didn't give all power back to the church. Now, what did he do? He really gave this acceptance of stability and peace. He gave the appearance of this to France, which hadn't really existed for a decade. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he's consolidating his power, his authority, and anyone who speaks out against him, publicly or privately, gone. No one knows exactly how many people actually of the National Assembly he executed. How many people in power that he had killed, or families killed, or simply disappeared. But historians have estimated this number can anywhere between 500 and 1,500 people who had power, authority, some type of government office, some power in the National Assembly, some type of power that could challenge him, or who might speak out against him, here today, gone tomorrow. He didn't have public executions. He didn't have anything that would make it look bad on him. He simply had his soldiers, and his army was very loyal to him. He basically came to dominate and control the entire military. His soldiers were very loyal to him. He had been a very successful general, had won multiple battles. He was effective. He used this as sort of his own private force to eliminate anyone who he thought might be a threat to him. He basically got rid of all of them. And he did bring stability to France. He actually brought what had been lacking for a long time. He brings sort of internal peace to the country. Sort of internal peace. Now, Napoleon's expansion in Europe. All along, this war was still going. This war was still being fought, his wars with all these other countries. Now, he does make a lot of treaties, starting around 1799-1800. The Treaty of Lunéville, if I'm saying that right, had Austria and Germany giving up lands across Europe to France. Treaty of Amiens left France in control of Holland and the Netherlands, completely in control of Holland and the Netherlands. All these lands effectively doubled the size of France. These wars were very successful. France became a global power. It already was, but it became even more powerful. This was great. The whole revolution, the second revolution, seemed to really do wonders for France. France became powerful and strong, doubling the size of the country, its territories. It gained overseas colonies. Very effective. Worked really, really well for them. And all this happened really, for the most part, under Napoleon. He was the most popular man in France. He was a national hero. He was the leader. He was everything in a bag of chips. He was great. Treaty of Tilsit. This was with Prussia. Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. He was involved in numerous battles with European powers. He wanted to continue to expand. He engaged and defeated the Prussian military forces. He took part of their country and about half their population with this Tilsit in 1807. Finally, by 1810, the only real country in all of Europe that had any real power that could stand against France was Russia. Russia was the only one who hadn't been defeated. And what happened under Napoleon is he conquered Europe. If you haven't quite got that from this. He conquered Europe. Almost every country, every major country in Europe either had to give up part of their lands, territory, their population to France, or in cases of like Holland and Netherlands, basically their entire country became under French dominance, with the exception of Russia. They had control of Europe. They dominated Europe and were basically the only power in Europe, except for England. England has always had that luck of having the island off the coast, and they've been lucky all through history to basically be untouchable, or almost untouchable. Even when the Spanish sailed up, some freak of nature destroyed almost the entire Spanish fleet, which happened years before this. But, like, England is just very interesting. Other than with us, the bad luck they had with what becomes the U.S., everything else, no matter what happened, they always somehow came out smelling like roses. And as it says there, Russia sort of accepts that, pardon me, Russia sort of accepts. Now, this is an incredibly significant picture, painting, here. Here we have Napoleon being crowned as the, how to put it, he's being crowned as the emperor of France, being crowned as an emperor. And you have to wonder about the relationship here it has with the Catholic Church. Now, he had brought the Catholic Church and given it a lot of power back. Not fully reinstated its power in France, but given it a lot of authority back. Given it a lot of its power back in there. And he himself was acting like a king. And so many other European powers understood this. The Catholic Church understood this. And they were watching the growing power of him as he headed more towards being a king. And the growing power of the church in France. The Catholic Church, which he was became very loyal to eventually. Now, we have Napoleon here who's seeking the church's authority. He wants the church to actually give him authority and give him power. if the church, first of all, France has already legitimized his rule. The people of France, the National Assembly has already said he's the ruler, he's the leader. With him conquering most other nations or them signing treaties with him, there's really only one authority in all of Europe that's really matters or counts, that's left, that hasn't globally recognized Napoleon's power. And that's the Catholic Church and the Pope. So what we get here is the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. And we have Notre Dame Cathedral here, which is a huge symbol of the Catholic Church, as his venue. He gets his supremacy by actually crowning Josephine, his wife, after he's crowned by the Pope. Yes, the Pope crowns him, and then he has the authority to actually crown Josephine, his wife, his queen. Now, by the Catholic Church giving him this power and doing this to him, and the Pope actually being there, it gives him... He has now been given the full authority of the people, the government. All the other nations have had to basically acknowledge his authority, and the actual highest authority in all of Europe, a lot of what is said, would be the Catholic Church, has now given him this authority. He considers himself emperor of Europe, basically. Emperor of France, technically, but he acts as though he's emperor of Europe. Now, these ideas of revolution were common people rising up to create equality and freedom. With that in mind, you really got to consider how all the people are dressed in here, too. This is supposed to be, he's supposed to represent, he's supposed to be the epitome of the common people rising up, revolting, throwing off all this royalty stuff and all this nobility stuff, and taking the power back. Look at all the people around and look at how they're dressed. Look at how the people look. Elaborate costumes, expensive wealth, expensive elites. A lot of actual nobility would be here. The nobility of the people would be here now. Lots of nobles actually had their power reinstated as well. Tall hats, furs, jewels, dresses, all kinds of fanciness. Napoleon and his predecessors, they rolled back almost all the radical revolutionary changes. Everything that happened over this 15 years, them representing and claiming to represent all the ideals of the revolution, what they actually did was took France back almost to where it started. The people who have power now again are the elites, the nobles, the church. Now we don't have a king, we actually have an emperor. Even higher than a king. And France was happy. Who was the fool? I mean, how did this 15 years, 2 revolutions, basically a global conquering of Europe, and somehow we actually end up right back where we started, and the people are happy? Or, I don't know. Go figure. Countless lives lost. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands dead across Europe. And we're right back where we started. Pretty much. It's not perfectly. There are some, there is some more opportunity for the middle classes, but are the peasants still peasants? Are the laborers still laborers? Are the poor still poor? Vastly across Western Europe, it's the same as it was 15 years before all of this insanity started. So we have this French Empire, huge, big parts of Italy, all the way to the edge of Spain, big parts of Central Europe, all the way into the north. These dependent states are these other places which are basically dependent upon or have allied themselves with the French, allied with Napoleon. I mean, look at this. Other than Russia, almost all of Europe is now either French, allied with French, or a dependent state upon France. Insane. He did it. He conquered Europe. Him and the French basically conquered Europe. Well, this couldn't last. This wouldn't last. Now, this which historians now call, I don't know if this is what he called it or what is now known as the Grand Empire, and he was a Grand Emperor of this. Now, the three parts of his Grand Empire included the ever-expanding France, the dependent small satellite kingdoms, and the allied states of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Those satellite nations, that's these dependent states, all these dependent areas, these satellite nations. And then the conquered territory, all that other conquered territory and allies. Now, Napoleon establishes, I guess you should, if you didn't already notice, what is the one place you don't have control of? Of course, Russia, they didn't defeat Russia, but Russia signed a treaty with them and acknowledged Napoleon's authority. The Ottoman Empire is the Muslim Empire, which they did actually take a lot of that land. Austria had actually conquered a lot of that territory. But who's the one that's left out? England. England is left out. This actually happens multiple times in world history, that Europe does something or is conquered by a power, and somehow England gets basically to be saved because they're an island out there and they're safe. So England is the only one that's really denied Napoleon's authority and power and denied France's ability to conquer them. England still has the largest navy in the world. The French didn't have that advantage. I'm sure the French had ships and they had naval vessels, etc., lots of trade ships. But the French didn't have the ability to basically load 1.5 million soldiers. And I think by the end of the Napoleon's conquering of Europe, he had close to 2 million soldiers. 2 million soldiers by the time he conquered Europe. Of course, he couldn't even begin to even get a fraction of those people across the water into England. The ships would have been sunk. It would have been a total disaster. So he couldn't really do anything about it. There's really nothing he could do to conquer England, even though he was able to do the rest of Europe. Well, but he does do this. He creates what it becomes known as the Continental System, specifically to try and defeat England the only way he can, economically. He's going to basically try to bring England down through use of the economy, which is really the only card he really had. He creates this shipping blockade between England and the rest of Europe, which England heavily traded with Europe. Of course, European countries traded with each other. He hoped this continental system would weaken England and weaken its military, since they were really the only ones resisting. Well, the continental system completely backfired, because it only favored France. It required payments and taxes to men and supplies and taxes and gold and you name it. All these other countries had to basically contribute to France, because France was trying to fight this conflict with England and the rest, and it had to continue to support all of France's population. Now, people saw Napoleon the other countries saw Napoleon as an oppressive tyrant. First, we see the French revolt, then the Russians revolt. We see France actually attack Russia and launch an entire army against Russia, all the way up into Moscow. There's been a thing that is said in Europe: you don't ever fight a war in Russia in the winter. You lose. It actually comes from this. Napoleon sent an entire army, tens of thousands of soldiers, to invade Russia. Something like 75,000 soldiers and all the supplies and all this stuff to actually invade and actually try to conquer Moscow. It fails miserably. It's a total defeat. They have to retreat. Many of them die of starvation and the cold, and this is where that comes from. And this has happened many times in history since this. You don't try to fight a war in Russia against Russia in the winter. You're going to lose. That's the one thing Russians know how to do, is fight war in the winter, and they're good at it. They're pretty hardy folk. Yeah, it was terrible, and it was really one of the most disastrous defeats Napoleon had ever had for his army, and it made him look really bad. It made, and what it did probably more than anything, is it energized lots of other countries that said, okay, well, if the Russians can defeat the French, and the Spanish are trying to fight back and defeat the French, well, we can too. Yeah. So it sort of leads to a massive country-level revolt all across Europe against France's sort of tyrannical government and this dictatorial emperor of Napoleon. Austria and Prussia resist and fight back. They abandoned Napoleon, the Treaty of Chaumont. They joined with Russia. They joined with England. And by 1814, basically all of Europe does the thing they never did before. They form alliances. They work together. We see combined armies of Austrians and Prussians and Russians. We see French and Spanish working together, French and Spanish ships working together. We see the thing that had not ever happened. We see the majority of Europe actually banding together, the different kings and royalty and militaries, all to take down this evil, vile tyrant who was oppressing all of Europe. We see basically an entire revolt of the continent against him, all vowing to destroy Napoleon. The French army is defeated. Eventually his own people rise up against him. He is captured, believing he is now the great savior of France a few years before. Now he's believed and seen to be the terrible downfall of France, because he has caused the entire world to basically attack France, and much more successful at it, and he's taken away in chains. However, due to the honor of what he had and what he did, and their belief that he was so powerful and he had done such a great thing for France, again, he had conquered Europe, they didn't want to execute him. They didn't believe it was a good idea to execute him, so they actually send him away into exile. They send him away to exile to Elba, a little island off the coast. They give him an estate there. They give him assistance. They basically set him up as a king over his own little empire of this little island, with everything he could ever want, everything he could ever want. The pleasures of the flesh, the food, wine. He had the perfect life with only one rule. He could never raise an army again or leave the island. Yeah. He escapes shortly after that, goes back into France, and of course he had been the great ruler for so many years, there were still a lot of people loyal to him, and raises an army. He raises another army out of nowhere in just a matter of months, and he starts to actually try to take over France again in hopes of starting it all over again. He's finally defeated, the final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo just a few months later. Again, he was sent into exile again to the island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821, and that is his grave right there. That is his gravesite on the island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. A very rich old man who had anything he could ever want, after having, which could be classified as one of the greatest conquerors probably in the history of the world. And, that's not necessarily a good thing. We're not saying that, because the wars he brought and the violence he brought cost the lives of countless people. But he did finally bring the revolutions to an end. He didn't start the revolutions, the first or the second revolution, but he did finally bring them to an end, but only by uniting all of France against the whole rest of Europe and then conquering all of Europe. It's quite interesting, the history of Napoleon and what happened with France. It changed the world. The effects of this, the socioeconomic, the political ramifications of what Napoleon did and the responses of Europe against Napoleon. Yeah. If we could call the 7 Years' War the first real world war, this would be really the second real world war. Again, we're going to call them that, but this really could be the second real world war, was Napoleon's war, the Napoleonic Wars. A lot of fun stuff. This is good stuff here, and that's the end, I believe. We're to the end, and I appreciate you going through it with me, and we'll see you next time.